Good evening. My name's Eileen Pittaway, and I'm the Director of the Centre for Refugee Research here at the University of New South Wales. And apparently I'm the official host of this conference, but that's a title which is a bit broad because it's being sponsored by UNHCR Regional Office, by the Refugee Council of Australia, and by 20 other non-government organisations, all who've come together, worked incredibly hard, and contributed the important amount of money that's needed to run a conference of this size. And you'll find the names of all of those wonderful sponsors on our conference programme. This event tonight is an important part of the conference, and I'm really proud to introduce two people who I admire really tremendously, who do great work in the field of the fight for refugee rights. One is Professor Jane McAdam, who works here at the university in the law faculty, and the other is Jeff Crisp, who is one of my favourite UNHCR people because he's one of the most honest UNHCR people that you can ever meet.
You wait.
As you can see, we are going to be privileged and perhaps a little voyeuristic because we're going to be sitting listening to a totally unscripted, spontaneous conversation between these two wonderful people. So I'm not going to waste any more of your time. I'm going to hand over to Jane and to Jeff. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, Eileen. And I too am delighted to welcome you here to this special event, which is part of the Centre for Refugee Research's conference, being held to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention. Now, I have to admit that this is a new role for me, that of interviewer, and it remains to be seen if I'm more of a Jana Wendt character or an Oprah Winfrey. But what I can tell you is that I'm not giving you all a car, and I hope that Jeff isn't going to jump around on the chair.
If Katie Holmes is here, maybe I will.
Well, we shall see. I just wanted to give a very brief introduction about the Refugee Convention and UNHCR to put the conversation in a context of sorts. Really just to say that the 1951 Refugee Convention remains the cornerstone of the international protection regime for refugees. Being very widely ratified, it has 147 states parties, either to that instrument or to its complement, the 1967 protocol. So among international human rights treaties, which I would count the Refugee Convention as one of those, it is widely ratified, although not so widely ratified in the Asia-Pacific region. UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, an agency often referred to in the media as simply the UN Refugee Agency, was established in December 1950 by the UN General Assembly. Its original mandate was for 3 years. That shows the hope of solving the refugee problem that states had at that time. Subsequently, its mandate was renewed for 5-year periods by the General Assembly until December 2003, when the General Assembly decided to remove the time limitation on UNHCR's mandate until the refugee problem is solved, which is perhaps optimistic, but also pessimistic at the same time. So UNHCR is mandated to lead and coordinate international action to protect and assist refugees and to resolve refugee problems around the globe. Its primary purpose is to safeguard the rights and well-being of refugees and other persons of concern, which include asylum seekers, stateless people, the internally displaced in certain contexts, and returnees. UNHCR also strives to ensure that everyone can exercise the right to seek asylum and find refuge in another country. Also, to ensure that people have the option to return home voluntarily, to integrate locally, or to resettle in a third country. In more than 5 decades, UNHCR has helped over 50 million people restart their lives and has earned 2 Nobel Peace Prizes in the process, one in 1954 and the second in 1981. Today, a staff of around 7,000 working in more than 110 countries continues to help over 35 million people. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight Dr. Jeff Crisp. Jeff is the head of UNHCR's Policy Development and Evaluation Service in Geneva. He works very closely with the High Commissioner himself, Antonio Guterres. Jeff has also worked as the Director of Policy and Research with the Global Commission for International Migration, which was established by Kofi Annan during his time as Secretary-General of the UN. Jeff's academic background is in African studies, and he's published extensively on refugee, migration, and humanitarian issues, as well as African affairs. During his time with UNHCR, Jeff has had the opportunity to evaluate many UNHCR operations in the field, as well as to work on a range of global policy issues. So after that very lengthy introduction, Jeff, welcome to UNSW and welcome to this conversation. I thought we'd begin at the beginning, if you like, and I wanted to ask you how it was that you came to be involved with UNHCR.
Okay. Before I answer that question, I'd like to start with 3 confessions. The first confession is that both Jane and I have had at least 3 glasses of wine before we started this conversation.
Speak for yourself, Jeff.
Well, I had 3. I don't know, in the hope of making it informative and entertaining.
Yeah, perhaps I should have had 3 glasses.
The second confession was I wasn't quite confident enough to come into this conversation completely unarmed, so we did have a little bit of consultation about the questions that might be asked, and I've made a few notes that I'm going to refer to because I want to refer to some facts and figures as the conversation proceeds. And I guess the third confession is that when Jane first invited me to do this conversation, I thought, bloody hell, it sounds like a cross between a chat show and a job interview. And now I'm here, it feels exactly like a cross between a chat show and a job interview. So in reference to those 2 issues, firstly, I'm not particularly looking for a new job. I'm quite happy with the one I've got. But if anybody can make me a better offer, then I'm quite prepared to listen to it. And in terms of the chat show, unfortunately, I have no movie or DVD or record to promote. So I'm sorry about that. In terms of my involvement with UNHCR, I'm going to, I think, be a little bit boring on this one, because what I've noticed over the years working with refugees and working on migration issues is that a great proportion of the people who work on such issues actually have a refugee or migration background themselves. Either they're refugees or migrants themselves, or somewhere in their recent or more distant past, they actually have refugees or migration in their background. And I would love to be able to sit here tonight and say, my ancestors were 17th century Huguenots who were persecuted in France and escaped to England, and that's where I came from. I would love to say, my great-grandfather was persecuted in the Russian Revolution and escaped, and that's why I'm here today. And in fact, I can't make any of those claims. I come from a very boring British family who basically took all of their holidays in the UK and never moved abroad at all. So I would love to be able to kind of claim some kind of refugee background, but I can't. My background is much more prosaic. As you'd already mentioned, I did my master's and PhD in African Studies in West African social history. I thought I would have a kind of regular academic career, but 2 things happened. Firstly, I didn't get a tenured post, so I was a failed academic. And secondly, I got a little bit bored with the academic scene in any case, so I decided to become a freelance journalist working on Africa. And after a couple of years working as a freelance journalist, I decided I needed to settle down and get married and have children, and decided that the freelance journalist life wasn't really appropriate in that respect. And so started to look for a job, and purely by chance, I happened to see an advert for a job with the British Refugee Council in London, research and publications officer. And I thought, well, I've done research, I've done publications, lots of refugees are in Africa, I know about Africa, why not put in an application for it? And it just transpired that I got the job. And that was really, I kind of fell into the refugee scene quite by accident. But I'm very glad I did so, because it's been extremely rewarding. And 3 or 4 years after joining the British Refugee Council, having published a book on refugees called Refugees, the Dynamics of Displacement, I was offered a job with UNHCR, and again, to be very boring, that's basically where I've been for the last 24 years.
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, it's always fascinating to see how people end up in a particular field, and often it is
Maybe you could tell us how you ended up in this field.
Well, to be honest, actually, my ancestors were Huguenots.
Oh, no!
So, you know, I'm one of the original.
Can I buy your family tree from you? Yeah.
But that's not why I ended up in the area.
Well, you proved my point, at least. Yeah.
No, it's actually not. I discovered that afterwards.
It's in the genes. It's in the genes. Yeah.
Well, for me, I think I always had a very strong interest in human rights law and international law, and it was when I came to study migration law at the University of Sydney that refugees kind of came into my frame of reference in terms of linking up those issues. And when I left university, I worked in the federal court as a judge's associate for a year, and the bulk of his work was dealing with asylum seekers. And I think that's when it really crystallised for me. I knew at that point I wanted to go on and do postgraduate studies, and that's when it crystallised for me that this would be the area. So the PhD led into the career that I'm in now. Well, Jeff, I suppose moving forward to the present day, just to give us a sense of the work that you're doing now, could you tell us about some of the projects you're currently involved with?
Yeah, okay, maybe the easiest way just to say what's happened since the beginning of this year. It's been a particularly active year. As you know, it's the 60th anniversary of UNHCR and the Refugee Convention. And I think we expected to have a little bit of time for kind of reflection and thought and analysis on that issue. But in fact, the hard realities of life have really kind of penetrated very quickly into our work. And so the first task we were asked to undertake this year, in 2011, was to undertake what we call a real-time review of the crisis in the Ivory Coast. Now, as you may know, with the political crisis in the Ivory Coast, this led to large-scale displacement, both within Ivory Coast, but also displacement to the neighbouring country of Liberia. And so the first thing we were asked to do this year by the High Commissioner was to undertake what we call a real-time review, which is an attempt to kind of go out to the field to look at a new UNHCR operation as it's unfolding and to make recommendations for change. And indeed, we found that operation was kind of deficient in several respects. The UNHCR response to the crisis as it was emerging was rather slow and ineffective. And so our first task was to make a number of recommendations to the High Commissioner and other members of senior management as to how that could be improved. That was the very beginning of this year. After this review of the Liberia-Cote d'Ivoire crisis, we reverted to some items on our more regular work programme. A couple of the issues that we've been looking at and which have already been mentioned in the course of this conference, both this morning and yesterday, the whole question of refugees in urban areas has become an increasingly important issue for UNHCR. And so in the early part of the year, we undertook 2 reviews of UNHCR's role in relation to refugees in urban areas, one in Nairobi, Kenya, and secondly in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, a very topical subject, as you know. Another key theme that we've been looking at over the last 2 or 3 years, and again, it's been a subject of some considerable discussion already here in the conference, has been that of long-term or what we call protracted refugee situations. And in the first 2 or 3 months of this year, we undertook reviews of the UNHCR role in relation to protracted refugee situations in Bangladesh, the Rohingya population in Bangladesh. But also, I was also fortunate enough to go to Eastern Sudan to look at the situation of Eritrean refugees in Eastern Sudan. As I mentioned this morning in my presentation, refugees who have been there for 35 or 40 years, one of the longest standing refugee populations in the world. After that, just a couple of months ago, reality intruded in a very rapid way again with the Libya crisis that nobody really predicted. UNHCR, as many of you will know, has been playing a major role in the response to the Libya crisis, dealing with the outflow of people from Libya, an outflow that includes Libyan nationals, that includes refugees, that includes economic migrants, foreign workers who are working in Libya, And one of our most recent tasks that we've been given, and we'll be starting soon after I get back to Geneva, is to take a look at that humanitarian evacuation program and to see how effective it's been and to make recommendations for change. If I could just add 2 or 3 other issues that we're looking at the moment, we've been asked to look at by the High Commissioner. One is, and I'll maybe come back to this issue a little bit later in our conversation, is to look at the impact of refugees on developing countries. I know there's a lot of concern here in Australia about the number of refugees you're receiving, about the impact they have, but as I'll probably say later, the numbers in the developing world are much greater and the impact is much greater, and we're trying to develop a better understanding of that impact. Another issue which is very much on our agenda, which we may come back to later, is the question of natural disasters. Natural disasters seem to be growing in frequency and intensity. UNHCR is becoming increasingly involved in the field of natural disasters. And one of the studies that we're undertaking at the moment is an attempt to identify exactly what are the protection issues in natural disasters that UNHCR could help to address and resolve. Are they the same kind of issues that we deal with in situations of armed conflict and persecution and violence, or do natural disasters throw up new protection issues with which we're not so familiar? So that's another study that we're undertaking. And then a third study I'd like to mention, just because it's quite novel, quite innovative, and I don't think has been done before. It was published just a couple of days before I came here to Australia, is a study of the artistic activities of refugees living in refugee camps. And I think this is like a new dimension of the refugee problem, which we haven't really explored before. We're so often completely preoccupied with very basic issues like food, water, shelter, sanitation. And we thought it would be quite interesting to look at the artistic activities that refugees undertake in refugee camps and the role and function that those activities play. So to sum up, I think we're involved in quite a wide and interesting range of activities at the moment. But as for the next 6 months, we're not quite sure what we'll be doing. It depends on what happens in the real world.
Yeah, so clearly you're not sitting there twiddling your thumbs in Geneva.
I think we're keeping relatively busy.
Sounds extremely busy. I mean, as you've just indicated, you've obviously travelled to a number of countries during your time with UNHCR. Reflecting on that and reflecting on the operations that you've evaluated, I wondered whether you could give us a sense of which has been the most challenging and why.
Okay, yeah. Well, I joined UNHCR a long, long time ago, before some of you were born, I'm sure, at the end of the 1980s. And looking back on it, it was a time of great optimism. The Cold War came to an end, the Berlin Wall fell. Some of you may remember we were talking about the peace dividend, that all of the resources that were being invested or wasted on armed conflict around the world would finally be able to be spent on development and peace building. And that was the kind of atmosphere that I entered UNHCR into when I joined in the late 1980s. And of course, we were very soon disappointed, and that perspective proved to be a rather naive one, perhaps. And this afternoon, when thinking about this, I just made a very quick list of some of the situations that UNHCR has been involved in since the time I joined UNHCR. Obviously, the Great Lakes crisis in Africa, Burundi and Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The former Yugoslavia conflict that lasted from 92 to 97, or arguably still existing today. Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, East Timor, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Somalia, Sudan, Chechnya, Cote d'Ivoire, Libya, to bring it up to date. So that idea that we had at the late 1980s when I first joined UNHCR that we'd be entering a new kind of era of peace and development has been very kind of cruelly disappointed for many of us. Now, thinking about, out of all of those operations, which was the most challenging, I was actually kind of, first thing I did this morning when I woke up in my hotel was put the TV on. And the first thing I saw was the exodus of refugees from Syria to Turkey. And really looking at those images, it really took me back to a situation in 1991, which I think, to answer your question more directly, was perhaps one of the most challenging situations that UNHCR has ever experienced. And again, some of you may not have too close a memory of that, so let me say a few words about it. You may remember that in 1991, following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the United States and other allied forces decided to intervene to push the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait and back into Iraq. And in relatively short order, the Iraqi forces were defeated. Following on from that, the first Bush administration in the United States basically encouraged the Iraqi people to undertake or engage in an uprising against the Saddam Hussein regime, which was exactly what happened. On the one hand, you had an uprising in the south of Iraq with the Shia population, but at the same time, you had an uprising in the north of Iraq with the Kurdish population. But the Saddam Hussein regime was not prepared to let that situation persist and sent in what was remaining of its army into northern Iraq in order to suppress the Kurdish uprising. And I think, looking back in my years in UNHCR, this was one of the most challenging operations that we've had to confront. Now, why was it exactly challenging? Firstly, sheer numbers. I think about 2 million people, 2 million Kurds in the north of Iraq were displaced in the matter of 1 or 2 weeks. We're operating in a very mountainous, hard-to-access area where the logistics were very difficult. I can remember flying over the area in a helicopter and just seeing this mass of people moving over the mountains, on the one hand, northwards to Turkey, but on the other hand, eastwards into Iran. And at the same time, while on the Iranian side, in fact, and Iran doesn't often get much credit, but I think in this respect we have to give it some credit. On the Iranian side, the Iranian government, the Iranian military, and the Iranian Red Crescent responded rather effectively to the refugee influx into Iran. The problem we were confronting with regard to Turkey was that Turkey, for its own security reasons, did not want to allow the Kurdish refugees to cross the border. And so in March 1991, it was still winter, it was still snowy. We had a brand new High Commissioner, Mrs. Sadako Agata, who had only just started office. We found ourselves with 400,000 Kurdish refugees stuck on the top of a mountain, not able to pass into Turkey, but unable to go back to Iraq because of the presence of the Iraqi military there. What happened shortly after that was that Turkey, supported by its NATO allies, particularly the United States, the UK and other countries, decided to launch a major humanitarian operation in northern Iraq called Operation Provide Comfort. And this really led to 2 very serious policy dilemmas for UNHCR. The first policy dilemma was that up until that time, UNHCR had insisted that Turkey should open its border and allow the refugees to cross the border and to take refuge in Turkey. But Turkey, backed by its NATO allies, absolutely refused to allow that to happen. At the same time, we were confronted with the choice as to whether to work with the Allied forces in northern Iraq, who had intervened in that part of the country in order to provide assistance to the people who were stuck on top of this mountain. And at that time, it may not seem such a big decision now, but at that time, this was a very major decision because, on the one hand, we'd always been rather wary of working with internally displaced populations in their own country. We'd insisted on the right of asylum, the right of people to leave their own country. And in this context, that didn't seem to be possible. And on the other hand, because of our humanitarian and strictly non-political status, we'd always been very wary of working with military forces. And so the High Commissioner, the new High Commissioner, who'd only been in office for a matter of weeks, had some very important policy decisions to make. And in the end, she decided, yes, we would have to work with these people inside Iraq because there was no way they were going to be admitted to Turkey. And yes, we would have to work with the military forces inside northern Iraq, even despite our strictly humanitarian and non-political status. And I think that was really a kind of watershed moment in the history of UNHCR. And many of the kind of activities and operations we've been involved in since that time have stemmed from that decision. So to answer your question, I would say northern Iraq in 1991 was a particularly challenging operation. At the same time, I think I'd like to suggest that challenging operations are not necessarily about large numbers. Challenging situations are also about very difficult protection situations. And in that respect, another situation I'd like to draw to your attention, something I looked at 4 or 5 years ago, was the situation of African refugees in Moscow. And perhaps out of all of my experiences in 24, 25 years of UNHCR experience, that was the most depressing one I've ever had, because when I went to Moscow, I found a relatively small number of African refugees. refugees who had never expected to end up in Moscow. They were transiting, hopefully transiting, through to Western Europe, but they became stuck in Moscow, stuck in an unfamiliar environment where the climate was particularly harsh, where they didn't speak the language, they didn't understand the culture. A situation where, although they were granted refugee status, because of the administrative requirements of the Russian government, they were not able to access any of the rights or services that should be available to refugees. And perhaps most terrifyingly, and I use that word advisedly, but I think most terrifyingly of all, African refugees in Moscow who were not even able to leave their houses because of the threat of skinhead and racist attacks on them. And so while the numbers of people in that situation are relatively small, we're talking maybe about 100 refugees, I think in many senses their situation was just as bad as those 400,000 refugees who were stuck on the top of a Turkish mountain, not knowing exactly which way to go. And the thing that I really thought, looking at that situation in Moscow, is what exactly can UNHCR do to fulfill its protection mandate in this situation? Can it actually post a protection officer with every single African family in Moscow in order to protect them when they go out onto the streets to do their shopping or to look for work or to go to the market? And so I think we're often confronted with challenging situations, but it's not just about numbers, it's also about the context.
You mentioned before that the UNHCR is dealing not only with refugees in camps but in urban situations. Is that one of the particular challenges of dealing with refugees living in cities and in towns?
I think that's exactly one of the major changes that we've witnessed over the past 5 to 10 years. I think we passed two important kind of thresholds over the last couple of years. One was that, in general, we came to a situation where over 50% of the world's population is living in cities for the first time in world history. But at almost exactly the same time, we came to a situation where over 50% of the world's refugees are also living in cities. And of course, UNHCR as an organisation has been very familiar with working with refugees in rural areas, living in refugee camps and refugee settlements. But I think in the past 2 or 3 years, we've really had to confront this issue of refugees living in cities. And it really is a completely different ballgame. When you have refugees living in camps, they're what you might call a captive audience sitting there right in front of you. You can identify them, you can see them, you can reach out to them relatively easily. But when you have a refugee population scattered throughout an urban area, it's a very different situation. So one of our main challenges in the past 2 or 3 years has been to develop a new policy on refugees in urban areas, but also to develop new ways of operating so that we can be more effective in meeting the needs of refugees who find themselves in towns and cities. And I think almost inevitably this is a process and a trend that's going to continue. As I mentioned in my presentation this morning, we see an increasing tendency for refugees not to go to refugee camps at all, or having spent a little bit of time in a refugee camp, to move on to the city where opportunities are more attractive and more available. And so that's going to be one of our key challenges in the years to come.
Well, if we can move then to the other situation that you spoke about, which I guess for many people is the image of the refugee camp, the pictures that we've seen with tents stretching for miles and miles. What sort of impact do camps like that have in very often the developing countries in which they're situated, both in terms of the refugees themselves, who often end up in protracted situations, but also on the local host communities?
Okay. Well, if I could take for the situation of the refugees, I think as we've discussed quite extensively already in the conference, I mean, the experience for a refugee in a refugee camp, particularly in a protracted refugee situation, where they have no immediate prospect of moving on or finding a solution to their plight, can be very devastating. And perhaps I could just mention one particular situation, that of the Dadaab refugee camp in northern Kenya. It was a camp that until relatively recently accommodated about 100,000 refugees, most of them from Somalia, but over the past 2 or 3 years has absolutely ballooned to the situation where it's now hosting around 330,000 refugees on exactly the same amount of land. And you can only imagine the kind of pressures that this places, both on the refugees themselves, but also on the organisations such as UNHCR, NGOs and others that are trying to meet their needs. It's a very, very difficult task indeed. In terms of the impact on the kind of local society and local population, I think we have to be a little bit careful. I mean, there's a lot of talk these days about the negative impact that refugees have. And that's certainly true if you look at a situation where refugees are living in a camp. Certainly, it imposes financial costs on the host government. There are certain economic, environmental, and infrastructural costs on local society. There are security issues. We can't avoid that issue. When large numbers of refugees cross a border and move into a host country, there are security issues that arise. There may be conflicts between the refugees and the host country. There may be conflicts between different factions within the refugee population itself. The influx of refugees from a neighbouring country can actually jeopardise the foreign relations that the host country has with the country of origin. So I think we have to be very much aware of the fact that refugee exoduses and influxes can indeed have some negative impacts. But at the same time, if I can take the Dadaab refugee camp as an example again, there was a recent very, very detailed study of the Dadaab refugee camp, and it actually showed that the refugee camp and the establishment of the refugee camp and its growth has actually brought a large number of new economic opportunities. And the study also showed that many Kenyan entrepreneurs had actually moved to Dadaab exactly to take advantage of the new opportunities that exist because of the refugee population there. And if I could simplify the report, it said that, you know, in simple terms, there was actually maybe a net gain for Kenya in accommodating such a large number of refugees. And I think you talked about the image of a refugee camp, and we all know the images we see on TV, tents or huts stretched out for mile on mile. But for those of us who have the privilege and the opportunity to visit refugee camps, something that always strikes me very forcibly is the very intense level of economic activity. There is no refugee camp in the world that doesn't have a very active market, people buying, selling, people making things, people trying to trade. And so I think we really have to kind of look at this situation, look at this question of the impact of refugees in both understanding the negative consequences, but also being aware of the positive impacts. And I think, unfortunately, the refugee policies pursued by quite a number of refugee hosting countries actually do not allow refugees to make best use of their productive capacities. A lot of refugee hosting countries in the developing world prefer to confine refugee to camps. They prefer not to give refugees freedom of movement. They prefer not to give refugees access to land or to income-generating opportunities. And I think our position in UNHCR is exactly the opposite. What we should be doing is to encouraging refugees to establish their own livelihoods, partly because it's for their own interests, for the refugees, whether they happen in the end to go back home, to remain in the country of asylum, or to be resettled, to live a productive life is advantageous in every respect. But also for the host countries themselves, it's in their interest to enable refugees to exercise their productive capacities and their innovative skills.
I mean, just thinking about those camps, clearly they're hosting very large refugee populations. To put Australia's refugee situation into context, can you sort of talk to us a bit more about where most refugees are in the world, what kinds of numbers we're talking about? I mean, Australia receives around 2% of the world's asylum seekers, and yet one would think, listening to the media and certain politicians, that we were taking the whole lot. So, I mean, where do we fit in this global
I'm very
context?
glad you asked that question, because I have the answer right in front of me.
Funny about that.
So this is a very recent paper that I prepared that I'll be presenting at a meeting in Geneva next week, and I'll just quote from it, because I think it, and the section of the paper is called The Statistical Story, and I think it really does tell the story to answer the question. And it says the following: the refugee statistics compiled by UNHCR tell a very clear story. Those states that have a relatively low gross domestic product per capita accommodate a large and disproportionate number of the world's refugees. It goes on to say, at the beginning of 2010, developing countries hosted some 8.3 million refugees, equivalent to 80% of the global refugee population. Just under a quarter of that number were to be found in the 50 least developed states. And then finally, of the 10 countries with the largest refugee populations in the world, 7 were to be found in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. All 25 countries with the highest number of refugees in relation to GDP would be found in the developing world, more than half of them in the least developed countries. So I think the story shown by the statistics is very clear, and I think my colleague Rick referred to this in his intervention yesterday at the conference, that by far the largest number of the world's refugees are in poor, low-income, developing countries. The number in the industrialized states is relatively small. The number in Australia is perhaps particularly small. And it's somewhat disturbing, and perhaps we haven't really got the message out effectively in this. It's somewhat disturbing when I see kind of opinion surveys in countries like my own, like the UK, and when members of the population ask, how many refugees are living in the UK, people often come out with, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million. And I think we really need to do a much better job in putting across this idea that the vast majority of the world's refugees stay in their regions of origin, often in neighbouring or nearby countries, and that a relatively small proportion make their way to the industrialised states such as your own and my own.
Well, it's interesting because recently I've done some field work in small Pacific Island countries such as Tuvalu and Kiribati. And one of the things the main thing I was looking at there was the impact of climate change on potential movement from Pacific Islands, where the longer-term rising sea levels may impact the ongoing habitability of such countries, but in the interim, various natural disasters and general interaction of climate change on underlying socioeconomic conditions may make life increasingly intolerable. And even though legally such people would not be recognised as refugees, the language of climate change refugees has started to be used. And so I was asking a number of people, what do you think of that terminology? And without any hesitation, everybody I spoke to said, we reject that outright. We don't like the label of refugee. And I said, well, why is that? And I thought maybe it's to do with Australia's asylum policy, that nobody wants to kind of be tarnished with the label of asylum seeker, particularly given that Tuvalu was one of the countries Australia had approached to have an offshore processing centre at one point. And they said, no, it's not to do with Australia. It's because we think refugees are helpless victims who are stuck in camps, who have absolutely no dignity, who are reliant on handouts from the international community. And as Pacific Islanders, we are very proud people. We want to be able to provide for ourselves and for our families, and we don't want to be seen as having no sense of human agency. They said, we would like to be seen instead as migrants who move with dignity and who move being able to offer their host country something in terms of skills and contribution. As a scholar of forced migration, I found that fascinating because we are always championing the agency of refugees and trying to talk to the media about not portraying refugees as victims, and yet that was the predominant image that they had, and perhaps that speaks to some of the failings of the international protection regime. But building on that, I wondered whether you could give us a sense of whether that image I've just portrayed there describes accurately the refugees you've met, or how you would characterise refugees today.
That's a good question. I mean, it is rather depressing that kind of both refugees and even more so the notion of asylum seeker have become so kind of negatively perceived in popular opinion, and particularly amongst politicians and in the media. And again, that's an area where we have to do much more, I think, to kind of change the perception. In terms of kind of the way I've met refugees and what conclusions I've drawn from my meetings with refugees, it will come as no surprise to you to hear me say that that doesn't correspond with my particular perception of refugees. And I'd like to give maybe 2 or 3 kind of anecdotal stories as to my encounters with refugees, if that's okay with you. 2 from Africa and 1 from Asia, in fact. The first one, and I always really cherish this memory, was several years ago. I was in Sierra Leone looking at a new influx of Liberian refugees just across the border into Sierra Leone. And I came across a young man who had just fled from his homeland, Liberia, and come into Sierra Leone. And the first thing he'd done was to try and make himself a very kind of rudimentary shelter. He'd managed to cut down some poles from the local forest, put in the poles in a kind of circle, and then he'd mix the mud and water and basically made a very rudimentary shelter where he could sleep for the night, having slept in the open the night before. And as I was watching him construct this shelter, I saw him put this mud on the surface of the hut, and then, to my complete surprise, he took a twig from the ground and wrote into the mud, inscribed into the mud, "This is not my home." And I just thought that was a fantastic observation, almost kind of surrealist in its perception. And I thought that gave me an indication of the kind of resilience of refugees and their determination to come to terms with a very difficult situation, but simply to get on with life. This guy had come across the border, very difficult situation, but his first instinct was to build this shelter, and then that inscription on it just said everything to me about how he felt about his situation. The second anecdote, and I'm going to use a bit of rude language here, I hope you don't mind, but most of you are Australian, so I'm sure you're used to that. I was visiting a refugee camp in Zambia, an Angolan refugee camp, and I had quite a long conversation with a very lively young man, and just as I was about to leave, he said, "Well, don't go yet. I'd like to give you a small gift." And I said, "Look, come on, you know, I'm a well-paid UN official. I really don't need gifts from a refugee, you know. It's very generous of you, but please don't offer me gifts." He said, "No, I insist on giving you a gift because I think if I give you this gift, it will help you to understand what I'm all about." So I said, "Okay, fine, let's have the gift." So he went into his hut, came back a couple of minutes later with a crumpled plastic bag and said, "Here's the gift." And I said, "Well, thank you very much. Can I open it?" And he said, "Yeah, good, please go ahead." And so I opened it, and it was a bright yellow T-shirt, a bit threadbare, but very carefully washed, very carefully ironed. And I opened it, and I saw the slogan on the front of the T-shirt, and it said, "Fuck politics, let's dance." And I think, to me, that said a lot about refugees, that they're able to actually maintain a sense of humour and a sense of perspective. And again, you know, if I was allowed to by a publisher, if I wrote another book, I think that's what I would give it as a title. And then a third anecdote, perhaps I could mention, coming from quite a long time ago during the Vietnamese boat people crisis, and an incident I found particularly touching. Some of you who are old enough to remember, that includes my colleague Rick, will remember that in the heydays or the bad days of the boat people crisis, throughout Southeast Asia, many Vietnamese boat people were held in what we called closed camps, which were basically detention centres surrounded by barbed wire, people sleeping in bunks, maybe 7 or 8 beds high, very, very difficult conditions. And not surprisingly, all of the refugees that were housed in those centres wanted to get out. And I remember going to one of these closed centres in Thailand, and as I was walking around, I felt a kind of a tug on my shirt, and I looked down, and it was a very small girl, about this size, and she's looking up at me with big eyes. And I said, "Yes, what do you want?" And she said, "Please, sir, can you find me a resettlement place in a third country?" And then I tried to engage her in conversation. It was quite obvious that she had no other English. She'd been schooled by her parents to approach any humanitarian worker, anybody who looked like they were a foreigner, anybody who was wearing a UNHCR cap, to say this, you know, "Please, sir, can you find me a resettlement place in a third country?" And it kind of brought back to me the kind of responsibility on us as humanitarians that in many ways, it's a bit mawkish to say it, but we do hold people's lives, you know, in our hands in some respect, and that's how we're perceived. And I think that responsibility will always live with me. And that particular incident, I think, will always live with me. And I always think of these three people, the guy with the hut, the guy with the T-shirt, and the young girl who wanted to be resettled, and I just wonder, where are they now? I hope they're in a good place.
Well, I mean, speaking about obligation, if we take that to the level of states, of course, at the beginning I mentioned, well, the purpose of the conference itself is to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Refugee Convention. A number of people say that, you know, at 60 years of age, this treaty has passed its use-by date, given that it was crafted in the aftermath of the Second World War, and defines a refugee as somebody with a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. And I wonder, Jeff, whether you think that this definition is outdated and whether the treaty does still serve a useful function. And perhaps a follow-on would be, do you think if states sat down today to draft such an instrument, we'd end up with anything better?
Yeah, okay. I mean, in preparation for the presentation I gave this morning, some of you may not have been there, but in preparation for the presentation I gave this morning, I did actually reread the 1951 Convention, which I hadn't actually done for a number of years, and I found it quite an instructive experience. I mean, to some extent, okay, the language is a little bit old-fashioned. It's a bit 1950s, which is maybe not surprising given when it was established. It's certainly not gender-sensitive. It refers to refugees as he throughout. It's a kind of a pre-gender-sensitive age. But in the basic elements of the convention, in terms of the definition, the exclusion clauses, the cessation clauses, I found it incredibly relevant. And to me, it was quite astonishing how much foresight the drafters of that convention particularly had. And I think Rick, my colleague here in Australia, mentioned in his intervention yesterday, you know, the 1951 Convention, it is one of the oldest human rights instruments. It's one of the most widely ratified human rights instruments. And particularly, as he said yesterday, it's one of the most operational human rights instruments. It's a human rights instrument which has really made a fundamental difference to the lives of millions of people around the world. And when I hear states and other commentators questioning the value of the 1951 Convention, which of course they're entitled to do, I get very sad and disappointed. I think we should be celebrating the 1951 Convention, celebrating the difference it's made for the lives of so many people, and looking to the future based on that 1951 Convention. And again, you know, something that strikes me looking at the 1951 Convention, as you said, it did have this definition of a refugee, but it's proved to be incredibly adaptable and flexible over the years. And if you think of what's happened in recent years, groups of people that were never really perhaps envisaged to come under the 1951 Convention have actually been protected by it in recent years. I'm thinking of, you know, victims of generalized violence, not simply people persecuted on an individual basis, but victims of armed conflict and war. I'm thinking of victims of trafficking, victims of gender-based violence. As we heard earlier today, there's been an amazing development in the past 12 or 18 months, which is to try and incorporate people who are persecuted on the basis of their sexual orientation under the 1951 Convention. And as a number of developing countries have been trying to say to us in recent times, this was never envisaged when the 1951 Convention was established, but it's an issue that's been taken up by UNHCR, and it's an issue that's been taken up by, for example, the United States government. And then most recently of all, we've been looking at the whole question of gang violence and victims of gang violence in Mexico and in Central America, and it seems that we can now perhaps begin to look at the claims of people who are escaping that kind of violence under the 1951 Convention. So I think, to sum it up, the 51 Convention is still relevant, and it's proved adaptable, it's proved flexible, and it's proved very relevant to contemporary needs. Now, moving on to your second question about the reformulation of the Convention, I think many of you will know that UNHCR's position on this has been that we are very wary of any discussion about reformulating the 1951 Convention, because almost inevitably, given the current political considerations, we would end up with something less liberal, less generous, less open than the 1951 Convention that we have. And something that's intrigued me over the years, I think over the past 10 years, a number of governments, the ones that come to mind, I think, are the UK, Belgium and Austria, have kind of made noises to the effect of the 1951 Convention is simply outdated. We need to get rid of it. We need to find something else. Interestingly enough, none of those governments have kind of actually pursued that option. And it would appear to be that they seem to recognise the need for an instrument that regulates the whole question of refugee protection. And it also seems to be the fact that they can't think of anything better that could take its place. So I'm relatively confident about the future of the Convention. Of course, we have to live with the fact that many states are trying to limit their obligations under the Convention. And we have to also recognise the fact that many states, particularly in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, are not actually signatories to it. But I think the 51 Convention has life in it yet. But I think I'm going to turn it back to you, because as a lawyer, you're probably in a better position to comment on this. Do you see that it has a future? Do you think that states will increasingly question it? Do you see any real prospect that a major state would actually say, we're going to withdraw from the Convention? Or do you think they'll continue to?
Well, I'd agree with your assessment. I mean, I think the Refugee Convention has been a very good example of a human rights treaty being a living instrument. and in fact in dialogue with international human rights law. The way that decision makers have gone on to interpret the Refugee Convention has been, consistent with developments in human rights law more generally. So I also would have grave reservations about the renegotiation of the instrument were it to be opened up or were we to sit down from scratch. In fact, that's an exercise I often do with my students. They've critiqued the convention, they don't like the definition at all, and then I'll say, right, well, it's 1950, sit there and draft it. Well, no, I pretend it's today, of course, sit there and draft a new, a new treaty, and they find it incredibly difficult to come up with any other useful definition. Okay. I suppose what I would say, though, is that the principle of non-return, principle of non-refoulement inherent in the Refugee Convention has also been developed through international human rights law as well.
Could I perhaps take you back to an issue that you raised a little bit earlier, and where you've got a lot more expertise than I have, which is the whole issue of climate change. Do you see that do you think the 1951 Convention has any relevance to people displaced or forced to move by climate change?
In some cases it will. I certainly think that the Refugee Convention is not going to address perhaps the majority of people who are affected by climate change, but there are a number of issues that I think need to be unpacked there. The first one would be that if a state were withholding access to particular parts of agriculturally productive land or something like that on account of a person's race or religion or whatever it may be, that may be in part because of climate change impacts that are rendering resources increasingly scarce, then yes, that may well come within the Refugee Convention. But I think the attendant issue is how we actually understand the impact of climate change on human movement, because climate change will never be the only thing that drives people to move. It may be the straw that breaks the camel's back, but it will always be something that overlays pre-existing stresses. And that's borne out in all the empirical studies that have been done to date. So that's a concern I would actually have in trying to bring climate change into an instrument like the Refugee Convention, because I think that causal relationship is very complicated and not easily established.
So I know you were at a very important meeting on precisely this issue in Oslo recently. Maybe you could say a little bit about what came out of that?
Sure, yes. Last week in Oslo, the Norwegian government sponsored, in conjunction with UNHCR, sponsored a conference again in commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the Refugee Convention, which was on precisely this, climate change and displacement. And 10 principles were adopted at that conference about this relationship. What came out, I think, quite strongly through the presentations was that the refugee paradigm is perhaps not the most appropriate way of looking at this issue, but that nonetheless it is very important to assess what obligations states already have under human rights law more broadly, the utility of an instrument we haven't discussed, the guiding principles on internal displacement, which govern states' responsibilities with respect to people displaced within their own country, which is by and large going to be the majority of people in this affected by the climate change phenomenon. And also that we need to look at broader principles relating to humanity, human dignity, and the duty to cooperate to ensure that there is some international responsibility sharing in this regard. And perhaps that's where some sort of new legal instrument would be best oriented.
Okay. And as you know, of course, the High Commissioner himself over recent months has made a very strong pitch for UNHCR to be much more involved in the protection of people displaced by natural disasters. And as I mentioned already, natural disasters seem to be linked to climate change. They seem to be growing in frequency and intensity. And as I'm sure you also know, a number of governments have expressed a bit of concern about UNHCR's extension of its activities into this area. I mean, do you have any personal perspectives on whether UNHCR should move in this direction or not?
It's an interesting one because there's an institutional gap here, I think, with respect to, certainly with respect to climate change. In terms of natural disasters, UNHCR operationally has been called upon to respond numerous times, historically as well as more recently, but the International Organization for Migration also has a certain responsibility towards natural disasters, as does the Red Cross and various other agencies, OCHA and so on. I mean, I think the focus on natural disasters as opposed to climate change obviates some of those causation difficulties that I mentioned before. And the sense I have too is that UNHCR is making a bit of a push towards taking a lead role in that, in that area. What I would say is that any action does need to be, I think there needs to be better coordination between the various agencies, but also between the international, the regional and the national and even the local levels, because there does sometimes seem to be a bit of a disconnect, and this is the same in refugee policy as well, between the normative frameworks and what's actually happening on the ground. And there was some discussion today that if you talk to the affected populations, whether they be refugees, whether they be people displaced by natural disasters, they're often the people who can tell you what the problems are and what the solutions should be, not necessarily people operating at the very high level of policy and legal frameworks who are sometimes somewhat disconnected.
I mean, something I found quite interesting is that I think 10 or 15 years ago, the whole notion of natural disasters became politically incorrect because a lot of people would argue that all disasters have some kind of man-made human element to them, but we seem to have reverted to the earlier language.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, that's something that is absolutely controversial, and that's why the language of climate change in there does suggest that anthropogenic element. No, I was reflecting on that myself. How come we're suddenly back to natural disasters? Perhaps just take natural out and talk about disasters, although that then brings in things like conflict as well. I mean, where do you draw the line? So yes, I mean, there's a long way to go. I think we're really just at the beginning of this discussion, but we're making a start with at least trying to set some basic framing principles for further action. So now I'm going to start asking you more questions.
I thought I'd turn the tables on
exactly.
that. You know?
How did that happen? That's lost control here. I guess we are almost out of time, but I don't think I can end the discussion before asking you a little bit more about internal displacement, given that UNHCR has extended its operations into looking at IDPs, and you mentioned that was not uncontroversial when it first occurred, at least at the operational level. Can you talk a little bit more about the particular challenges that confront UNHCR in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, UNHCR has a kind of an interesting history in relation to internally displaced populations. It's been involved with such populations for quite a large amount of time. I think certainly we can go back to 1972 in Sudan, where UNHCR became involved with an internally displaced population. And particularly from the late 1970s onwards, UNHCR came under a lot of pressure from a number of different advocacy groups to become more systematically, more predictably, more regularly involved with internally displaced populations. I think for two reasons. Firstly, because the number of IDPs was actually going up very quickly and soon became larger than the number of refugees. But secondly, there was again an institutional gap. And I think a lot of advocates saw UNHCR as the natural agency to fill that gap because of the close similarities between refugee situations and situations of internal displacement. But it wasn't really until the mid-2000s, I think 2005, 2006, that UNHCR was finally convinced to commit itself to a more systematic and a more predictable role with internally displaced populations. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, out of the total number of people that we work with, IDPs are significantly larger now than the number of refugees or indeed asylum seekers. Having said that, I think, as you've already hinted, there are some specific challenges in terms of working with IDPs as opposed to working with refugees. I think the first thing we have to recognise is that IDPs are citizens living within their own state, and that primary responsibility for those people must lie with the government of the country of which they're citizens. And that's a very different situation from those of refugees, where refugees actually cross an international border and seek some kind of international protection. And so I think a lot more emphasis has to be made on the responsibility of the country of origin and the government of the country of origin in terms of protecting and assisting its citizens who have become displaced. Another complication is that when refugees cross a border, UNHCR often has to deal with the authorities of the host country, But UNHCR doesn't have to deal with the forces that are actually creating the displacement. That's very different in a situation of internal displacement, where UNHCR is by definition obliged to deal with and work with, to some extent, the very actors that are actually causing the displacement. So one could take an example, for example, such as Colombia, where UNHCR has to work with both the government military forces but also paramilitary forces, both of whom are involved in the actual act of displacement. So that's a much more complicated scenario than a traditional refugee situation, where people have actually left a zone of armed conflict where they were obliged to flee. Going on from that, I mean, almost by definition, working with IDPs does entail working in areas of active armed conflict or post-conflict situations. I'm thinking particularly here of a situation such as Sri Lanka, where UNHCR has been very actively involved over the years, where UNHCR had to work with both the government and with the Tamil Tigers, the LTTE. And I was there relatively recently, and even though the conflict itself is over, northern Sri Lanka is still a very, very highly militarized zone with army checkpoints and army bunkers every 200, 300 meters along the main roads. And UNHCR simply has to work in that context. Again, it's very different from working in a more traditional refugee situation. Similarly, in many cases, working with IDPs, it's very difficult to access those populations for security reasons, for logistical reasons, etc. And I think maybe Darfur, the Darfur region of Sudan, would be a very good example of that. At the same time as those kind of very practical, logistical, operational problems, I think working with IDPs also poses a couple of more kind of conceptual problems for UNHCR. The first is that unlike refugees, which is a category firmly kind of ensconced in international refugee law in the Refugee Convention, the notion of an IDP is not a legal category. And there are a number of people who would argue, including the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I've got quite a lot of sympathy with their perspective on this, that displacement shouldn't be the only criterion we use for assisting or protecting populations. We should be looking at civilian populations more generally, and if we do that, we may well find that people who haven't been displaced, are subject to similar kinds of human rights violations, similar kinds of lack of assistance, lack of access to basic resources. So simply focusing on the sheer act of displacement is not really adequate from a humanitarian perspective. We also need to look at civilian populations as a whole. And I think another, perhaps a slightly more esoteric issue, conceptual issue that's confronted us with IDPs is the question of what is a solution for an IDP? I talked a little bit this morning about solutions for refugees. There's a very kind of clear doctrine about solutions for refugees. It's either voluntary return, local integration, or resettlement. We're not quite so clear in working in an IDP context what solutions actually means. Is it, for example, justifiable to relocate an IDP population from one part of their country to another in order to find them a durable solution? In recent times, I've come across a couple of proposals that even IDPs should be incorporated in resettlement programs. So that, for example, a country such as Australia would not only be resettling refugees, but also resettling people displaced within their own country. Is that a viable approach? So I think there's a number of issues around the whole kind of IDP question that we're still thinking through and trying to resolve.
Well, we've almost come to the end, but there is one final question that I would like to ask you, Jeff. And that is that I understand that during the course of your work for UNHCR, you've dabbled a little bit in witchcraft. Can you tell us a little more about that, please?
Well, I have to plead guilty to begin with. And let me just say how this came about. A couple of years ago, I was in Angola looking at the return of refugees from two neighbouring countries, from Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in one very remote area, we were told by a local NGO that many of the returning refugees had been accused of witchcraft by the settled population. That in fact they'd had to establish a safe house for elderly women who had been accused of witchcraft and could no longer live safely in the community. Around the same time, a colleague of mine in my unit was undertaking a similar review of the return of refugees to southern Sudan. And she came across almost exactly the same scenario, that refugees returning from countries such as Kenya and Uganda, Ethiopia, were in quite a few instances being accused of witchcraft, and they'd had to make special arrangements in order to protect these people. So I thought, well, this is not coincidental, the fact that two similar situations have both given rise to these accusations of witchcraft. So simply speaking, I simply went on to Google and typed in witchcraft refugees displacement. And one of the first things I discovered, which I hadn't known before, was that many of you will be familiar with the Salem witchcraft trials in New England in the United States in, I think, the 18th or 17th century, I can't quite remember. And something I hadn't realized was that those witchcraft accusations took place in a context of armed conflict and internal displacement in that country. So I thought, oh, we're onto something here. There seems to be quite a common trend of situations of displacement giving rise to witchcraft accusations. So we decided to take this a little bit further, did a little bit more research, and indeed we found there was a very close connection between displacement and witchcraft accusations. And perhaps it's not entirely surprising. Firstly, we have to come to terms with the fact that witchcraft is an element of society and culture in many parts of the world. It's certainly not simply an African issue. We found examples in many different parts of the world. But also, if people experience devastating experiences, they're traumatized, their world is turned upside down, people are trying to make sense of that, trying to come to terms with that. And one of the easiest ways to do that is simply to scapegoat members of the population to say, oh, this has happened to me because of you've cast a spell on me. And in our research, we found that indeed, it's the most marginalised members of society who are normally accused of witchcraft. It's often elderly women, it's often young children, it can be the disabled, it can be, as we've seen in Tanzania and Burundi, albinos, a very tragic case in recent times. And so a number of my colleagues, when I started this little project, told me I was completely mad and said, look, if you do this witchcraft stuff, Jeff, you'll never be taken seriously again. But in fact, we managed to produce, I think, quite an interesting paper on the subject. We set up a blog on displacement, human rights, and witchcraft, and in fact managed to get the issue onto the agenda of the Human Rights Council and on the agenda of the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings. So I think, it's been quite a successful example of raising awareness of a subject which had been neglected, and which is, I think, for me and for those of us who worked on it, a genuine protection issue. And I think the more we can do to protect people in that situation, then the better that we can do.
Well, that's a very good note to end on, I think. Look, Jeff, thank you so much for such an engaging conversation, and I think for bringing to life the work that you do for UNHCR, but that UNHCR as an organisation does all around the world, and for highlighting some of the highs and lows of the job, and hopefully in this 60th anniversary commemoration year, taking stock of where we are, but looking forward to the future and how we can better protect the rights of refugees.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.